Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. Coming up this morning, more Mississippians are willing to roll up their sleeves for COVID-19 vaccinations. That is one of the findings of the latest State of the State survey by Millsaps College and Chism Strategies. We'll hear about those findings, responses to the minimum wage push, and much more with Millsaps scholar Nathan Schrader. Also, new federal indictments against Nancy and Zachary New. The welfare scheme suspects now stand accused of defrauding the education department for millions of dollars. We'll take a closer look. Our guest today is Dr. Nathan Schrader. He chairs the Department of Government and Politics at Millsaps College. He heads the American Studies program there, and he's one of the lead researchers on the State of the State surveys. Nathan, welcome back to Mississippi Insight.
Thank you, Byron. It's always good to be with you on Insight.
Well, first thing first, who did you survey this time around, and when and how did you reach them?
Well, Byron, this represented the 14th quarterly installment of the Millsaps College Chism Strategies State of the State survey. And what we do in order to reach the most representative sample possible of Mississippi voters is that we take a look at the 2020 voter turnout data. We determine who are the people that are registered to vote and are people that have turned out to participate in elections before. And with a sample of 602 Mississippi voters, we were able to utilize the most cutting edge of the scientific process of public opinion research to find that sample that most clearly represents the real electorate, the full electorate of the state of Mississippi. And that's who we surveyed.
All right, let's break down the big jump in vaccine acceptance since the last survey in January. Now that the COVID-19, the question was now that the COVID-19 vaccine is available, do you intend to get it? And over 48% definitely will get vaccinated on that survey. And there's about 14 or so percent probably will get vaccinated. What do you make of those numbers and the jump there?
Byron, we were without, usually we attempt not to show any sort of bias in our findings here. But as Mississippians who, like all of your viewers, you and your viewers, have been waiting patiently for the last 12 months for life to hopefully start to get back to normal and for us to finally defeat this virus, we were all thrilled to see the share of Mississippians climbing who say that they either intend to get vaccinated or they already have been. The numbers, there are two numbers that stood out to me, and I think every viewer needs to hear it, is that back in early January, we had about 50% of the population of Mississippi, of the Mississippi voters, that is, tell us that they may refuse to be vaccinated. That's considerably higher than what we would want, of course. Fast forward to 2.5 months later, we're down to roughly 20%. Telling us that they may or probably will not be vaccinated. Another 5% are still on the fence. But that turnaround, as we described it in our report, that U-turn, if you will, is remarkable if you want to think about how many people's lives that could impact.
And how do these numbers break down demographically?
Well, no, we're seeing it compared to the demographics of the early January 2021 poll. In almost every demographic group, we saw tremendous gains in people saying that they're going to be vaccinated or they intend to be vaccinated. And in some cases now, they already have. Now, that's even true among the groups that were already higher than average in saying that they're likely to get vaccinated. They're now even saying so at a greater rate. The highest, the folks who are telling us that they're either intending to get vaccinated or already have been at the greatest rate are your folks 65 and up, which is, of course, that's a good sign for so many reasons. If you're looking at this from a public policy or public health perspective, your 18 to 34-year-olds, so that could be your folks with young children. They're looking, these folks that are in college or folks with young kids at home, or potentially caring for older relatives or parents. Then Black voters and college graduates are the ones who already were likely to tell us that they're going to get vaccinated, but now they're doing so at a considerably higher rate, even than where they were a month and a half ago. But on the flip side of the coin, we still see some demographic groups, even though the majority of them say they intend to get vaccinated or they already have been, they lag behind the rest. And that's really your folks in the 35 to 54-year-old category and some Republican voters. Still, the majority, though, Byron, of those groups, they say they're going to get vaccinated or they intend to, but they lag behind the average and the rest of the demographics.
Well, Governor Tate Reeves revoked county mask mandates and other COVID-19 restrictions at the top of the month, though he continues to promote masking and other safety measures as a matter of choice. How did the survey respondents react to that?
Well, quite frankly, Byron, the majority of Mississippi voters, 55% of them said that Governor Reeves lifted those mandates and restrictions too soon. And only about 30% said that this was the right time to do it. But interestingly enough, and because we heard all throughout the course of this pandemic, some of the loudest voices in the room were the people saying that these restrictions were always excessive, they were always too much. We found that only 13% of Mississippi voters believe that those restrictions should have been lifted even sooner than they were. And that tells us, that's one of the important takeaways for me, at least from that data, is that there are far fewer people in that camp. It just so happens that they tend to be the loudest voices in the room. So a very small share of people saying that the restriction should have been lifted a lot sooner, telling us that the majority, 55%, are saying that this happened a little too early in their view.
You also asked about the thoughts on the just passed American Rescue Plan. What did you learn from those results?
Well, here's an interesting statistic, Byron. We compared in Mississippi what we found in our poll that by a margin of plus 22 points, Mississippians approve of President Biden's American Rescue Plan that passed with only one vote, Benny Thompson's vote, out of the Mississippi delegation to the House and the Senate. But nationally speaking, that number is plus 24. So Mississippians track very closely to their counterparts in the rest of the country, at least in terms of the overall margin of which they approve of the American Rescue Plan. The only difference is we have a large, more undecided folks here in Mississippi than what we've seen in the national polling, about 20%, but over half do support the nearly $2 trillion plan that was passed by the Congress and signed by the president. That was one of his signature promises in his early days of the administration.
One of the initial parts of the plan was an increase in the minimum wage, national minimum wage, to $15. That didn't make it through the final bill, but it remains a big point of the debate. How did you approach this issue in the survey, and what did you find out?
Well, we wanted to try something that was, again, a little different than just asking Mississippi voters whether or not they just flat out approve or disapprove of the minimum wage increase. What we did was we posed this question in a way that let them tell us clearly whether they were opposed to any change. But if they were voters who were telling us that they support raising the minimum wage, we gave them those options as to tell us how much do you think that ought to increase to. So here's again, a piece of data that I really think sticks out. Only a quarter of the voters in Mississippi say there ought to be no increase. It ought to stay at $7.25 an hour. That is almost identical to where this was about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when we asked about this the last time. So there's been no real movement in terms of more people saying that they don't want the minimum wage increase at all. But a fascinating figure here. There's been a significant amount of growth among the share of Mississippians who say we ought to raise it, but not just raise it, but do $15 an hour. That was the plurality of the respondents. About 31% said that we shouldn't just raise it, we should raise it to the $15 that some politicians in Washington are asking for. Another 25% said we ought to start at $10 an hour. And another 12%, 13% were at $12.50 an hour. We're kind of putting that in the middle. Those voters are probably a little closer to where, say, Senator Mitt Romney's compromise plan was, which was to start at around $10, index that to inflation so you eventually get to the 15 rather than just jumping to the 15.
We'll have more with Millsaps' Nathan Schrader and the State of the State survey when Mississippi Insight continues. We we've been dealing with a severe and chronic water system outage here in the city of Jackson, and this has become a statewide issue given the scale of the bill for infrastructure repairs and upgrades. What do the respondents have to say about all of this?
You know, Byron, this was something I was really intrigued by what we would find here, because remember, we polled Mississippi electorate on the city of Jackson, the capital city's water crisis and infrastructure crisis. We weren't just polling Jacksonians. These were the voters. This was reflective of the entire state. And what we found is that 55% of Mississippi, a little over 55% of Mississippi voters statewide, believe that the state of Mississippi and its citizens have an obligation to help the capital city through this crisis and to work on making the upgrades and repairs that are necessary to hopefully keep this from getting worse. And so 55%, a little over 55% statewide say that there is an obligation to help the capital city. Only 29-30% say otherwise. But in a follow-up question, we did ask them, who ought to be responsible at the end of the day for paying that bill? Who's on the hook? And we had nearly 33%, a little over 33% say that it has to be a combination of federal, state, and local resources that is not just going to need to fall on the shoulders of one entity. And so just 33% had said the city of Jackson alone needs to shoulder that burden. So the majority of voters, with only that, a majority of them, nearly 60% are saying someone other than the city alone has to step up and pay for this to prevent the capital city from going through this kind of crisis again in the near future.
And when it comes to state politics, you asked, do you believe the state of Mississippi as a whole is headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? Where did you respondents put it there?
Yeah, look, Byron, this was a fascinating point. We have been measuring voter approval on the direction of the state, right direction, wrong direction now, for 14 quarters. And this goes back to 2017. This was the highest share of the voters who said that we're moving in the right direction, about 51%, as opposed to the 37% who said otherwise. This was a area of improvement for the state. So something, Byron, that I really want to emphasize, though, oftentimes when you and I get to talk about the state of the state survey, we deal with some things that are very they aren't the most pessimistic kind of responses, and some of the issues and challenges that we talk about after these surveys are done. There are some kind of some rays of light here, with the increasing share of people with getting vaccinated, but also a larger share of Mississippi voters starting to think that maybe the state is starting to move in the right direction. That is an area of improvement. And maybe, maybe voters are looking at this saying, well, look, we're vaccinating folks. Mississippians are going to try to get back to normal soon. The things in that capacity are going well, so it's influencing the way they look at how the state is going as a whole.
Yeah, you asked a question about the legislature, which typically isn't very popular amongst voters, but you said, do you approve or disapprove of the performance of the Mississippi State Legislature? And the numbers aren't that bad for the legislature.
Right. Byron, the legislature, again, also posted what for our poll, they're just slightly underwater here, but that's a vast improvement. We were looking a few cycles ago at the legislature that was underwater by double digits. At one point, they were at -13, -14 points. Now they're around -1 in the net approval, disapprove rating. They've turned that around a little bit. And again, I would speculate there are some things that the voters are hearing coming out of the Capitol, the teacher pay raise, for example, which looks like it's headed to the governor's desk this week. That has been picking up steam. Is very, very popular. Over 80% of Mississippians back that, and they kind of see the legislature acting on it. So there are certain things that they're hearing and seeing coming out of the Capitol that they really like these days. And I think that's helping to influence some of their perceptions of the legislature itself and their own legislators in their districts.
Yeah. We're seeing the rise in gas prices right now, but there's also been a long talk about the raising of the gasoline tax, and you've asked that question about where people stand on that issue since it hasn't been raised in 34 years. What are voters saying?
Well, voters are saying that for the most part, they're split. They don't necessarily want the gas tax increased, but here's an important takeaway. Compare this to what we found in all of our previous polls. The need to improve the quality of the infrastructure and the roads and bridges is very high. It ranks very highly with voters. But what we see when we ask about paying for this with a tax increase or a gasoline tax increase, that is not very popular. So the voters want something, but they're not convinced that they want to pay for it, or they're not convinced how to pay for it. Where the division comes in is how are we going to mandate that increase? So, 35% say we got to leave it where it is, and it's in the same place it's been for 34 years. Another 10% say don't raise it at all, don't leave it where it is, cut it. So you're looking at 46% off the bat saying we don't want an increase at all. You have another 6% who don't know, aren't quite sure, haven't made up their minds. But you're split then between those who say that the legislature ought to do this and raise it legislatively, which is what would happen in most states. So that's about 17%. But you've got another 32% who want to proceed the way that Senator Trey Lamar had proposed earlier in this legislative session, that instead of having the legislators do this, that you put it up for a statewide referendum. That it tests considerably more positively among voters than the legislature just coming into session and raising the gasoline tax.
And finally, you asked, President Trump is still very popular here in Mississippi, and you asked whether he should be the nominee for the Republican Party in 4 years from now. What are voters saying there?
Well, I want to specify one point, Byron. We only ask that question to Republicans. So because they would be the ones voting in the Republican primary election for president in 2024. Donald Trump is wildly popular among Republicans in Mississippi. That has not changed. 66% of Mississippi Republicans say they think that he ought to run for the Republican presidential nomination again. Only 19% say he should not. The Republicans in Mississippi are with Donald Trump, at least as of now, and nearly 70% think that he ought to try this again, run a third presidential campaign in 3 election cycles.
All right, Nathan Schrader, Millsaps College, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
After the break, we'll look at new federal fraud indictments against Nancy and Zachary New. You're watching Mississippi Insight on WJTV. Welcome back. You may recall the names Nancy and Zachary New. Mother and son are 2 of the 6 defendants in the Mississippi welfare fraud scheme. Now, on top of state charges, the News face federal indictments for allegedly defrauding the state education department. 12 News' Alex Love brought us up to speed on this big development.
After being released on a $10,000 bond and pleading not guilty, Nancy and Zach New left the Thad Cochran Federal Courthouse with nothing to say after being handed 16 more charges by prosecutors. They range from conspiracy and committing wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and unlawful monetary transactions exceeding $10,000. This case revolves around the News allegedly pocketing over $2 million in grants from the Mississippi Department of Education for the last 4 years, exceeding what their school was legally entitled to. Prosecutors believe they falsified documents to claim teachers and students who no longer or never worked and attended New Summit School, making the Department of Education send payments meant for salaries or programs the News took for themselves. Despite signed checks in their names leading a trail of public funds to their own accounts with Trustmark Bank, the defendants' lawyers have faith that the News are innocent with no strong evidence from prosecutors.
They haven't given me any evidence that indicates to me, convinces me, that these people have committed any crime at all. I think everybody's rushed to judgment on them just because they're worried about this large amount of money that we're talking about. Don't get blinded. Keep your eye on the ball, okay? I mean, did they commit a crime or not has to be decided, first of all. I don't think so.
It doesn't make me believe that Nancy New's a criminal. Nancy New's not a criminal.
Why do you say that?
I just, believe me, I have faith in my client, and she's looking forward to her day in court. And I think I think probably what will happen is the real story will be told.
Even after refusing to answer our questions, Nancy picked up her son outside the Westin Hotel, where she avoided driving our way by backing up a one-way street with the help of a valet stopping traffic.
Thanks. 12 News' Alex Love. We'll be right back. Dr. Nathan Schrader from Millsaps College and our own Alex Love for their contributions this week. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a great weekend.